From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden promises a push for Supreme Court reform during his last 6 months in office, and the media leaks have already begun to suggest what he could have in mind. Plus, Justice Elena Kagan tells a judicial conference she wants lower court judges to investigate allegations against her and her colleagues. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. In a speech to the nation on Wednesday night, occasioned by his decision to forego running for re-election, President Biden said he isn't off the job and he will keep speaking out on climate change, fighting for his cancer moonshot, and so forth. And then he said this, quote, "I'm going to call for Supreme Court reform because this is critical to our democracy," unquote. Kim, leaks to the press as early as a week ago said as much, including some details about what Biden was considering pushing for, including term limits on the justices, apparently passed by some legislation through Congress, an enforceable ethics code, and maybe a constitutional amendment to override the justices' recent decision on presidential immunity in a case called Trump v. U.S. So let's go through these one by one. And the place that I start is President Biden's own Supreme Court commission, because remember in 2020 during that election, Biden was trying to fend off the left's calls for court packing, and one of the ways he did that was promising in a classic political punt that he would appoint a commission to study the issue if he was elected. He did, and that commission duly issued a more than 200-page report going through some of these suggestions, including term limits. And Kim, it is not clear that the commission got over its own reservations about that idea. They went through this idea that Congress, without any sort of change in the Constitution, could impose some kind of junior justice, senior justice system. Here's how they describe it. After 18 years of service, justices become senior justices and stop participating in the ordinary work of the court. They would instead perform different or subsidiary set of duties. But Kim, I think there are real questions about whether even that would pass constitutional muster. And by the way, who would get to decide on that? It would be the current Supreme Court.
Yeah, let me just point overall, I mean, this is so classic Democratic line these days, is we've got to rip up the foundations of our democracy somehow to save it. And this harebrained idea is one of them, term limits for the justices. Now, what they are claiming, because obviously, look, there are some huge constitutional issues here because judges are afforded lifetime tenure. And the critics of the current court that are desperate to think of a way to water down the influence of the current conservative majority say, well, here's a precedent. We currently have a model that lets federal judges take senior status, but they don't really have to entirely quit. And we could look at that as a way and a model of going forward with this that would require these folks to essentially stop performing the everyday average duties of a Supreme Court justice after 18 years. The problem, though, is that is not really an adequate precedent. That is, Congress was giving jurists, those were getting older, a way to stay involved while voluntarily cutting their workloads. But it doesn't necessarily mean that Congress can just strip them of the right to hear cases of a judge who has been duly appointed and has been confirmed, and who, by the way, if they were appointed at a young enough age, might only be 62 years old at the time or 65 years old at the time that those 18 years are up. And so I think that this is kind of harebrained. It's unworkable and it's absolutely unconstitutional any way you structure it. But it's a sign of the president's desperation. He's trying to motivate that base, and Supreme Court reform is something that does resonate with some voters who have been unhappy with some of the Supreme Court decisions.
I share those concerns about the constitutionality. It seems that this proposal, to my eye, is too clever by half, if I can use that phrase, trying to redefine the office of Justice of the United States so that it includes a kind of term limit without actually taking away the title of Justice of the United States. You just become a senior justice, except that, by the way, you're not allowed to sit on appeals anymore, which to my mind is the entire point of the office of the Justice of the United States. There are also practical considerations with this kind of idea, Monet. One of them is, what if a justice has just a year or two left in their term and then dies or retires for some reason? How do you go about filling that slot if there's only a year left on the term? Do you leave it vacant? Do you have somebody in there? Another is that if you're going to term limit justices who might be 62 years old, say, when they run out on their term, then maybe they're going to find some kind of after Supreme Court employment. And it creates a lot of sticky questions about whether there would be limits on that, whether those limits themselves are going to be constitutional. And then here, let me read a piece of a statement by one of the conservative members of Biden's Supreme Court Commission, Adam White. And this is about politicization of the court. This is a separate statement, not part of the commission's official report, but he says, by tying Supreme Court vacancies and appointments directly and exclusively to the outcomes of presidential elections, a term limits framework would further corrode the appearance of judicial neutrality and independence, making the court a spoil not just of politics, but of presidential politics exclusively, unquote. And Monet, the argument there is that if every presidential candidate who wins is guaranteed 2 Supreme Court appointments every 2 years on a fixed schedule, then there will be much more pressure to name those people who they would be during the course of a presidential campaign.
Right. I think that all of these potential pitfalls of term limits beyond the constitutional question are very good reasons why the framers of the Constitution decided to grant lifetime appointment in the first place. It is very simple to be able to have these justices, once named by the president and confirmed by the Senate, occupy that chair for a very long time. And the irony is that the critiques being made by President Biden and by Democrats today about the impartiality of the justices, they're always alleging that conservative justices in particular are being biased in their approach. This is something that lifetime tenure helps to avoid because they're able to escape the influence of any interest after they would leave the court. They know that they're going to be able to make rulings that are in keeping with what they think is the actual correct constitutional interpretation, and they're much less beholden to any external political compulsion because of that lifetime appointment. And I think it's worth mentioning that President Biden and others, allies in Congress, like Sheldon Whitehouse, Dick Durbin, who have been pushing for reforms of the court, haven't actually pointed out any connection between lifetime tenure in particular and the negative outcomes that they're alleging. Their goal really is to exert more power over the court and particularly to speed up the timeline on which this conservative majority is going to age out and liberals will be able to regain control of the court. And so I think that people should look past the very thin motivations that President Biden alleges with regard to these reforms, and it's very obvious that it's all about reasserting liberal control over the court's governing majority.
Hang tight, we'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Let's turn to the second idea that has been floated in the press that President Biden could call for, and that is some sort of enforcement method on Supreme Court ethics. The justices unanimously last year issued a code of conduct that, to my eye, looked like a restatement of their existing principles. But one person who's now adding her name to this call for some enforcement mechanism is Justice Elena Kagan. This week, she was at the 9th Circuit Judicial Conference in California. She said that the ethics code issued by the justices was a good one, but here's a piece of what she followed that up with. The thing that can be criticized is rules usually have enforcement mechanisms attached to them, and this set of rules does not. She went on to say it's a hard thing to do to figure out who exactly should be doing this and what kind of sanctions would be appropriate for violations of the rules. But I feel as though however hard it is, that we could and should try to figure out some mechanism for doing this. Kim, she went on to say that her favorite idea is to have the Chief Justice, John Roberts, set up some kind of outside external judicial panel filled with esteemed lower court judges who could review allegations and complaints made against the justices. What do you make of that idea?
Well, look, I leave it to the court and the justices on it to work through these ideas. And I think one really important aspect of this Elena Kagan proposal, and it is a little bit different than anything we've heard from the justices justices so far, and notable in that up to now they had been united. Most of their responses to these calls by Democrats in the Senate had been in a letter that was sent and signed by all of them in response to those calls, talking about their ethics policy and essentially adopting one, as it were, that wasn't really much different than what was there, but it was, them banding together to say, we've got this, essentially. So now this is Elena Kagan suggesting they need to do yet something more. It's not clear that that view is shared by other justices or how many justices it might be shared by. The most important thing to me about this is that she appears to be suggesting that if anything does happen, it be done by the court itself. And namely, there she was talking about John Roberts appointing this group of lower court justices who would look through these complaints and render some sort of decision on ones that come in. This is obviously nowhere near what Congress has been suggesting, that it should be allowed to write the rules for the court and come up with these very complicated procedures whereby people can lodge complaints and there'd be new standards for recusal, all kinds of stuff. So I'd look at this as a more minimal, graduated step toward tougher enforcement and mechanism and code, but one, again, where she is arguing it should come from the court. I think that's important because, as we have made the case, we argue, and I think it's correct, it would be, again, unconstitutional for another branch of government to tell the court how it operates itself. She has not gone that far. Look, I think there are also some real issues incumbent and problems potentially in what she is suggesting. It could further politicize the court. But I think the distinctions are important here about what she is saying and isn't saying.
I take that distinction that perhaps there would be a difference in the Supreme Court doing that on its own rather than have it being forced on them by Congress. So there would still be something particularly odd, I think, given the structure of how the judiciary works, where you have district court judges and their decisions get appealed and reviewed by appeals courts, and those decisions get appealed and reviewed to the U.S. Supreme Court. So there would be something a little bit strange and inverted about having lower court judges, no matter how esteemed and long-serving, reviewing the outside conduct, the personal conduct of Supreme Court justices. And as Kagan mentions in that quote I read, what kind of sanctions can that kind of a panel put on a Supreme Court justice who has life tenure under the Constitution? Would this panel have subpoena power or some kind of authority to force the justices to come in and answer questions about the allegations? And my bigger concern, Monet, is that this kind of formal structure for these allegations would only invite more of these allegations, many of which I think do not meet the standards that judges normally apply for recusal or disqualification or conflict of interest. And you can look at these complaints that are raised by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who left and right is calling for somebody to recuse for something. Here is a press release from May 24th from Sheldon Whitehouse talking about these flags that allegedly flew outside Justice Samuel Alito's house. One, an upside-down U.S. flag amid the dispute with a neighbor around the time of January 6th. Another, this appeal to heaven flag from the Revolutionary War at his beach house. And here's what Sheldon Whitehouse and Senator Dick Durbin say. By displaying the upside-down and appeal to heaven flags outside his homes, Justice Alito actively engaged in political activity. They go on to argue that Justice Alito created reasonable doubt about his impartiality and his ability to fairly discharge his duties in cases related to the 2020 presidential election and the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And Monet, I think that is, for all intents and purposes, pretty meritless. You might make an argument that it was not a great look for these flags to be flying outside Justice Alito's house, and any Supreme Court justice should maybe bulldoze the flagpole as soon as they take possession of a new property, or at the very least, only fly the U.S. flag that unites all Americans. But the idea that these are related to cases, and dismissing Justice Alito's explanation that his wife had flown those flags and he had no input or control over them, and he had asked her at one point to take down the upside-down U.S. flag, I worry that handing this kind of stuff over to some sort of formal judicial panel to do an investigation, and we'll get back to you later and issue a report, would only feed these kinds of allegations and invite more frivolous allegations that don't really relate to the kind of conflict of interest standards that judges generally operate under.
Right. I think that's exactly the point of of creating this board of lower court judges to review ethics complaints against the Supreme Court justices. We know that Democrats in Congress and a lot of the media are already in the business of constantly hunting for anything that could be construed as disreputable on part of the conservative justices, turning it into a big story and suggesting that it's a reason for these justices to recuse. There's the Alito flag story that you mentioned. Let's also not forget the allegations made against Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, for text messages that she had sent after January 6th. And the idea was that this implicates the judgment of the justice, and they then have to recuse from any case that's related to President Trump or similar connections that are being drawn by their opponents. And I think that Sheldon Whitehouse and Dick Durbin have been very frustrated that these assaults haven't really been effective at turning public opinion against these conservative justices or forcing them to recuse from any of these cases. And so they want to create this formal board of lower court justices that would be able to take up complaints like this and then validate it by giving it the imprimatur of having been an official ruling after an investigation by other judges. And so we know that the type of complaints that they intend to bring are frivolous because that's what they've done in the past. And the only reason they're seeking this kind of formal reform is to add teeth to it and to try to dress it up as being some kind of official process rather than their own salacious allegations being moved mostly through the media. And I think that the Supreme Court justices obviously responded to the push for ethics reform last year by creating a code of ethics of their own, and they basically reapproved the long-standing standards for recusal, which are that if you're going to recuse, it should be because you have an actual financial or affiliation connection to one of the parties in the case, and not because someone somewhere alleges that you're biased for whatever reason they choose. And it would be a huge error to create a formal process in which anyone in the public could raise a complaint. It would force these justices to waste their time defending themselves, and it would harm their reputations whether or not they're actually found to be liable for any kind of ethics violation. But all of this, again, is just about creating more of a formal cover for these sorts of attacks that Democrats have been engaged in for years already.